all of you. Welcome to Gravitas. My name is Priyanka Sharma. Let's get started. Xi Jinping has arrived in Central Asia. This is his first foreign trip in nearly 1,000 days. Rest assured, there is an agenda. And that is going to form our top focus on Gravitas today. Beijing is hoping to reassert its global influence at a time when ties have hit rock bottom with the West. And things back home aren't too great either. From protest over zero COVID to a struggling economy, Xi's got a plateful of problems. So now the Chinese leader is trying to shore up allies and forge new ties and create a fresh narrative that he is the leader of an anti-Western alliance. So how will he achieve this? We'll break it down on the show for you today. Xi Jinping is a man on a mission. The year 2022 was supposed to be a landmark year for him, the year that will put him on the same pedestal as Mao Zedong, the founder of modern-day China. 2022 was supposed to be all about Xi breaking the precedent and locking up a record-breaking third term as president. But it hasn't gone according to plan. An out-of-control pandemic, and of course the chaos of zero COVID, an imploding real estate sector, and a stumbling economy. They have all ruined Xi Jinping's big party. The Chinese president needs a new narrative now. So he is making a comeback on the world stage. Today, he kicked off a diplomatic tour, his first one since the pandemic began in 2020. The idea is to build momentum for next month when Xi will be confirmed as president for another 5-year term. Before that happens, the Chinese president is trying to reassert his influence and present himself as a leader of an anti-Western alliance. So what is his pitch? Let's tell you about the specifics now. Xi Jinping has chosen Central Asia to resume his overseas engagements. He is visiting 2 countries in particular, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. He arrived in Kazakhstan today. This is his first stop and an important one for Xi Jinping. In 2013, the Chinese president had launched the Belt and Road Initiative in Kazakhstan. This initiative, or the BRI, is his signature infrastructure plan. And Kazakhstan is an important transit hub for China. It is also a supplier of minerals, metals, and energy. There is a security dimension to this relationship too. Kazakhstan shares a border with Xinjiang, and this is the province where China is accused of carrying out a genocide against the Uyghurs. Xi Jinping's second stop is, of course, Uzbekistan. He will be attending the annual SCO summit, an event that will be attended by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, along with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So that's the agenda of Xi Jinping. The Chinese president landed in Kazakhstan today, but he set the tone before his arrival. Xi Jinping wrote a piece for a leading Kazakh newspaper. He spelled out what he wants to get out of this trip. And here's the article that I'm talking about now. It is headlined, "Build on the path to make greater strides in China-Kazakhstan relations." But this piece is not just about China and Kazakhstan. It goes beyond that. In this article, Xi Jinping is talking about the need to change the global order. Allow me to quote, "We need to enhance coordination within multilateral frameworks such as the UN, the SCO, the CICA and the China plus Central Asia. We should reject unilateralism and bloc confrontation and jointly push for an international order that is more just and more equitable. That's the message of Xi Jinping. The Chinese president has two clear objectives here. Number one, he wants more influence on existing global institutions. And number two, promote groupings where China dictates the terms. Both of these goals are impossible to achieve without the active support of allies, and that's why Xi Jinping is making an outreach to Central Asia. And the Chinese president is not traveling empty-handed. In Kazakhstan, he came bearing gifts. A series of bilateral agreements were announced. Both sides are deepening their economic and security ties, and needless to say, these agreements also reassert China's influence on Kazakhstan. Honestly, this has become quite obvious now. Take a look at this. Xi Jinping was given an award today, the Order of the Golden Eagle. It is the highest honor that the president of Kazakhstan can confer on anyone. And that's the kind of clout that Xi enjoys in Kazakhstan. Tomorrow, he will try to extend that very influence during the SCO summit. The Chinese leader is expected to make the same pitch in Uzbekistan and present the SCO as an alternative to Western alliances. Russia has already endorsed China's position. Ahead of the summit, the Kremlin's foreign policy advisor spoke out. His name is Yuri Ushakov, and here is what he said. The SCO offers a real alternative to Western-centric organizations. All members of the SCO stand for just world order. A similar message is also expected to come out of the Xi-Putin bilateral. The two leaders are likely to meet on the sidelines of the SCO summit, and this will be their first face-to-face interaction after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They have met once before in February, and this was just before Russia began its offensive. Back then, Putin and Xi had declared a no-limits partnership. A pull aside in Samarkand will reaffirm China's support for Russia. There is speculation about another bilateral, a one-on-one between Xi Jinping and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The two leaders haven't met since 2019. The reason for that is obvious: China's continued provocations at the border. But Indian and Chinese forces have recently disengaged from a flashpoint in Eastern Ladakh. But will that enable a meeting on the sidelines? New Delhi hasn't sent out any signals. China, too, isn't saying much about Xi Jinping's potential engagements at the SCO.
The diplomacy of the head of state is an important political guarantee for the stability and long-term development of Sino-Russia relations. For a long time, the heads of state of China and Russia have maintained close exchanges and strategic communication through various means, leading the bilateral relations to always maintain the correct development direction. Regarding the specific issue you mentioned, I currently have no information to release. If there is relevant information, we will release it in a timely manner.
The plot thickens. Xi Jinping is guaranteed a third term, but he clearly doesn't want to leave anything to chance. With the SCO summit and the outreach to Central Asia, the Chinese president is hoping to resume in-person diplomacy and step up China's engagement with the world. But problems back home could derail all his efforts. And now, speaking of problems back home, tensions are brewing again in Xinjiang. The United Nations recently concluded that China may have committed crimes against humanity there. Instead of ending its crackdown, Beijing is now doubling down. This time, the pretext is the pandemic. Xinjiang has been under a draconian lockdown for more than 40 days now. There is growing discontent over the zero-COVID policy in particular. People are starving due to the curbs. Reports now claim that protests have broken out and the Chinese state is mobilizing its resources to crush all voices of dissent. Before we play out that report, we'd like to advise viewer discretion. Some pictures in this report are disturbing.
Zero COVID has reached Xinjiang, and it is making the life of residents miserable. The people are now desperate. This video has emerged from Xinjiang. A resident, presumably frustrated with the lockdown rules, fell to his death. There are more horror stories. Another resident put out a video. She was crying out for food.
5 gün buldu, davet bana 5 gün.
Chinese social media has been flooded with similar tales, and each one is more horrific than the other. In this post, the user is seeking help for a child who is suffering from high fever. This post is apparently about a patient who is at home without food. Screenshots of WeChat messages are being shared too. This one describes the tale of parents who were seeking medical attention for their child. They were ejected by the hospital's emergency room. Allegedly, the child has passed away. Reports say at least a dozen residents have met the same fate. They passed away either due to a lack of medicine or starvation. All this is the result of the total lockdown orders in Xinjiang. The region has been under a lockdown for over 40 days now, and with each passing day, the suffering of the residents has become more severe. Chinese officials have resorted to draconian measures to crush the outbreak. Residents have been locked up in their homes, and patients have been coerced into traditional Chinese medicine. Community workers, without any empirical evidence, have been pushing these cures. They are being distributed in white bottles, like this one. Those who refuse to take it are being threatened with detention. The harsh and severe response to the outbreak triggered a protest. More than 600 young Uyghurs took to the streets. They held a peaceful protest and complained about the lack of food and supplies. How did the Chinese officials deal with this protest? They launched a crackdown. All of the protesters were detained. Chinese authorities are now using their vast security apparatus to crush dissent against the Communist Party. The same surveillance measures used to go after the Uyghurs are now being used to enforce the lockdown rules. Xinjiang is the latest victim of zero COVID. But the latest wave of state-sponsored crackdown must be reminding them of China's repeated human rights violations in the region.
Right, let's move on now. Central banks are like umpires in cricket. If nobody is talking about them, it means things are fine. It means they are doing a fine job. But if they are on the front page, rest assured something is wrong. Today is one such day. Everybody is talking about the US Federal Reserve. Why? Because the US inflation data is out. We'll start with those numbers now. Consumer prices increased 8.3% in August. Compare this to the months before. In May, it was 8.6%. In June, it was 9.1%. And in July, it was 8.5%. So compared to that, the August numbers are less. Having said that, three problems remain. Number one, the market expectations. Experts were hoping for 8% inflation in August, but the final data is much higher. It is 8.3%. Number two, month-on-month inflation compared to July. America's consumer prices surged 0.1%. It was unchanged from June to July, but in August it surged 0.1%. And finally, problem number three, core inflation. Meaning that consumer prices minus the volatile stuff. I'm talking about things like food, fuel, things that affect all of us. America's core inflation actually increased 6.3% in August. Both June and July posted around 5.9%. So considering these three factors, America's inflation data is not so impressive. Yet, it is lower than July and June, but still too high for comfort. And that's where the Federal Reserve comes in. Later this month, America's central bank will unveil its next policy move. Now, the market expectation was clear. They wanted some relief from the interest hikes, but with the latest inflation data, that's not happening. Chances are there will be more interest hikes. Experts are split between two options. Either a 75 basis point hike or a full 100 basis points hike. Either ways, it means one thing alone, that economic growth will slow down. On Tuesday, US markets reacted sharply to this piece of news. The Dow Jones closed 3.9% down, Nasdaq closed 3.5% down, and Standard & Poor closed 4.3% down. Clearly, the markets are expecting a downturn. You see, when central banks hike interest rates, there is a chain reaction of sorts. Lending comes down, spending comes down, jobs disappear, and the economy as a whole slows down. The next big question, what is President Joe Biden's plan to tackle this? Well, on Tuesday, he was taking a victory lap. He invited lawmakers, cabinet members, activists and interest groups to the White House. What exactly was he celebrating? The Inflation Reduction Act. Last month, Biden passed this legislation to tackle rising prices. It is expected to cost around $430 billion. And yesterday, he celebrated it. Well, talk about poor timing. While Biden touted his massive spending bill, the U.S. inflation data trickled in.
Exactly 4 weeks ago today, I signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law, a single most important legislation passed in the Congress to combat inflation and one of the most significant laws in our nation's history, in my view. I said it then, and I'll keep saying it. With this law, the American people won and special interests lost.
Now let me tell you how all this affects the rest of us, the rest of the world. How does US inflation data affect us? Let's look at Asian markets first. India's Nifty closed 0.3% down, so marginally in red. Japan's Nikkei closed 2.8% down, South Korea's Kospi 1.56% down. And the Shanghai Composite 0.8% down. So Asian markets are spooked by inflation data. But how exactly does that work? How does US inflation affect countries like India? Because of two major reasons. Number one, the strengthening dollar. India is an import-dependent country, which means if the dollar gets stronger, we end up paying more. And this is called imported inflation. And right now, things are headed that way. The rupee is trading at 79.4 against the US dollar. Experts say it could slip below 80 or even 81. If that happens, India's imports will become more expensive. Let's now come to reason number two, a capital exodus. When interests rise, investors move away from volatile assets. These could include equities, cryptocurrencies, and commodities. In other words, there could be a sell-off. So how should India tackle this issue? Frankly, it's a tricky decision for the Reserve Bank of India. Let's look at the data first. India's wholesale inflation slowed to 12% in August. It was almost 14% in July. At the same time, retail inflation quickened. It was 6.7% in July. But last month, it increased to 7%. So the market is sending mixed messages to the RBI. Another factor to consider here is economic growth, of course. India's GDP grew 13.5% in the first quarter of this financial year. Sustaining that growth is now a priority for the government. So which way will the RBI go? That depends on a lot of factors. If the RBI does not hike interest, there will be more imported inflation. The rupee could slide further. It could also trigger an exodus from the Indian markets. But if the RBI does hike rates, growth will suffer. Right now, experts are predicting the second scenario, a rate hike, perhaps a 50 basis point increase. But the central bank also faces subtle pressure from the government. Last week, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman dropped a few hints. She said the RBI had to be more synchronized to handle inflation. And that's the worry for India. Runaway inflation could be a major problem here, especially with 200 million people below the poverty line. So is the prospect of stalled growth? The Indian economy has to create jobs for its youth, and that means monetary loosening. So the RBI faces a tough decision at its next meeting in late September. And this is a story that we will keep tracking. Now it's time to shift our focus to a story that the world is eagerly watching and tracking. Imagine you are inheriting the most important throne in Europe. Imagine you're succeeding the longest reigning queen in history. What would be your first order of business? Frankly, to just stay out of trouble. But it looks like King Charles did not get this memo. He is making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Let me show you two separate instances. The first one is from Northern Ireland. On Tuesday, King Charles made his first trip as monarch. He was signing the visitors' book at the Hillsborough Castle. And take a look what happened next.
Is it September 12th?
13th, sir.
Oh God, I'm the wrong date. 13?
Yes, sir.
You signed 12:30. We're never going to do it. I signed 10. Oh God.
Oh look, it's going everywhere. So nobody got trouble.
What is that?
Oh look, it's so
Come on, there's bloody thing. what they do every stinking time.
We've all seen that. All that fuss over what? A pen. King Charles's pen was leaking ink all over his hand. So what does the monarch do? He has a mini breakdown. Now don't get me wrong, we all have been there before. Sometimes the smallest thing can get on your nerves. But when you are the King of Britain, can you afford to do that? And for the record, this wasn't King Charles's first outburst. That was on Saturday. He was signing documents after his proclamation ceremony. Take a look at what happened next. Clearly, pens are not the king's favourite. We are barely a week into his reign and he's had 2 breakdowns over them. Like I said, it can happen to any of us. But for King Charles, the expectations are huge. He succeeds a queen who perfected the art of bottling up emotions. You never saw Queen Elizabeth lose her temper. You never saw her laugh hysterically. She was always calm and composed in public. Which is why these videos have become controversial. They are adding to the anti-monarchy sentiment in Britain. We told you about this on Tuesday. British cops are rounding up Republican protesters. But wait till they hear the next bit of news. The British government has planned an extravagant funeral for the Queen. Dozens of ceremonies, processions, gun salutes, visits by world leaders. It promises to be a massive affair. Can you guess the total cost? According to some reports, $9 million. $9 million for a funeral. Now, there is a precedent for such spending. In 2002, when the Queen's mother died, Britain spent £5 million on the funeral. Today, that's worth almost $16 million. In 1997, Princess Diana's funeral cost between £3 million and £5 million, and that's around $10 to $17 million today. Remember, this is not coming out of royal pockets. This is taxpayer money. There is criticism around this extravagance, especially considering Britain's economic situation. Energy bills are expected to rise 27% in the winter. Almost 1.3 million Britons could fall into poverty. Simply put, people are struggling to make ends meet. And what does the government do? Spend $9 million on the Queen's funeral. I'm sure there are precedents about how the funeral must be done. In Britain, it's like a constitutional obligation, but the fact is, times have changed. Spending $9 million on a funeral is not tradition anymore, it's a blunder. And why just the funeral? Let's talk about the time leading up to the funeral. Britain announced 10 days of mourning when the Queen died. The period ends with her funeral on September 19th, which, by the way, is a public holiday. The London Stock Exchange will be closed, banks will be closed, all of which means massive losses for Britain. How much money are we talking about? According to some estimates, the September GDP could take a 0.2% hit. Imagine that. One funeral and the GDP falls 0.2%. And it's not a first for Britain. In the month of June, their GDP dropped 0.6%. Guess what happened in that month? There was an extra public holiday to honor the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. You see, the economy is a very precise system. Even the slightest disturbance can derail it. Case in point, public holidays. September will have an extra holiday because of the funeral, and that means the economy will take a hit. So does this mean that Britain should not commemorate and celebrate the Queen? Of course not. Britain is more than capable of making its own choices. My point is this. Queen Elizabeth is being remembered for her service, for her dedication to Britain. In that case, would she approve of such extravagance? Especially when her countrymen are staring at higher inflation and even recession. British taxpayers have always footed the monarchy's bills, their weddings, their travels, their estates. Everything is funded by the British state. But how long before the people revolt? This sort of out-of-touch spending is exactly why Republicans want to abolish the crown altogether. The funeral budget is playing right into their hands. Let's move on. Our next story is from Kabul. It has received a letter from Islamabad. A letter seeking the arrest of Maulana Masood Azhar. the chief of Jaish-e-Mohammed, the most wanted man in India, and a UN-designated terrorist. 23 years back, he was released from prison by the Indian government in exchange for hostages from an Indian Airlines flight. Since then, Masood Azhar has been a free man. He has appeared at several rallies in Karachi and orchestrated multiple terror attacks on Indian soil, like the 2001 attack on the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly, the 2001 attack on the Indian Parliament, the 2016 Pathankot attack, the 2016 Nagrota attack, the 2016 Uri attack, and the 2019 Pulwama bombings. All of them were masterminded by Azhar, with blessings from the Pakistan Army and the ISI. But the same Army and ISI are now acting blissfully ignorant. They say they have no idea about Masood Azhar's whereabouts. But they do believe that he could be in Afghanistan. Pakistan's Foreign Office is adding wings to their claims. They've written a letter to the Taliban seeking Masood Azhar's arrest. The letter is not the first of its kind. In January this year, Pakistan had written a similar letter to the Taliban, requesting them to send Masood Azhar back to Pakistan. Where exactly do they believe he's hiding? Somewhere in the jungles of Nangarhar or the lush valleys of Kunar. These are two border provinces in Afghanistan. Pakistan says Masood Azhar is taking shelter in either of them. Is there any basis to this claim? Not really. For all you know, this could just be another hogwash, one that could help Pakistan exit the FATF grey list. You see, next month, the FATF is holding its plenary session. It will sit down to review Pakistan's performance, the steps it has taken to combat terror funding, the strides it has made in reining in terrorism. This session will, in essence, seal Pakistan's fate. It will decide whether the nation should remain on the FATF list or be removed. The decision will be taken basis on a 34-point task list. One of the tasks happens to be Masood Azhar's arrest. Clearly, this task has not been fulfilled. The terrorist remains at large. So what does Pakistan do? It feigns ignorance and plays dumb, pretends to not know where Masood Azhar is. And this is a classic escape technique, one that Pakistan has used several times. We've seen this before. Only that this time, no one's buying it. India, for one, is calling it a repeat of the Sajid Mir drama. For the unversed, Sajid Mir is another Pakistani terrorist who was behind the 26/11 Mumbai attacks. Until last year, Pakistan had declared him dead. But in April this year, right before an FATF session, this man was suddenly found alive, arrested by Pakistani authorities, and convicted on terror charges. So what we're seeing right now could be a replay of the same script, but with a new character. My point is quite simple. Pakistan is finger-pointing at Afghanistan to wash its own hands of all responsibility. It is accusing Afghanistan of sheltering Masood Azhar so that nobody blames its own rogue agency. Who knows if he's really hiding in Afghanistan or is at an ISI safe house in Rawalpindi instead. The Taliban itself has denied Pakistan's claims. It says that not only is Masood Azhar not hiding on its soil, but if Pakistan continues to make such unwarranted allegations, it will adversely affect the bilateral relations between the two. Let me now quote from the Taliban's warning. We reiterate that the IAA does not allow any armed oppositions in its territory to operate against any other country. We also call on all parties to refrain from such allegations lacking any proof and documentation. Such media allegations can adversely affect bilateral relations. Pakistan would do well to remember this warning. It should also think twice before blaming Afghanistan, because the country is not ruled by any ordinary regime. It is ruled by the Taliban. They may or may not be sheltering Masood Azhar, but they certainly don't like being questioned. If Islamabad nudges them any further, there's no guarantee if they'll keep quiet. Now, I'd like to talk about a social media giant which has been courting controversy of late. The former security chief at Twitter has told the US Congress that the platform is plagued by weak cyber defenses. Simply put, it can be exploited. It can put the privacy of users like me and you at risk. Moreover, he says that there are foreign agents working within Twitter's ranks and manipulating user data. But my question is, are you surprised? Are all these allegations really shocking? Let's find out.
This is Peter Mudge Zatko, the former head of security at Twitter, and now the company's biggest critic. In January this year, he was fired by Twitter over poor performance. Zatko says that was a lie. He says he was fired because he attempted to flag security lapses to Twitter's board.
To put it bluntly, Twitter leadership ignored its engineers because key parts of leadership lacked the competency to understand the scope of the problem.
So what sort of lapses did he flag? There are several, but two stand out. Number one, Twitter is plagued by considerably weak cyber defenses, which makes it vulnerable to exploitation by hackers. Two, Twitter's leadership has misled government regulators about its security flaws and vulnerabilities. And three, there are foreign agents in Twitter's ranks, spies acting on behalf of a foreign government and manipulating user data at will. Listen to this.
What I did notice when we did know of a person inside acting on behalf of a foreign interest as an unregistered agent, it was extremely difficult to track the people. There was a lack of logging and an ability to see what they were doing, what information was being accessed, or to contain their activities, let alone set steps for remediation and possible reconstitution of any damage. They simply lacked the fundamental abilities to hunt for foreign intelligence agencies and expel them on their own.
So who are these foreign agents? And which countries are they working for? So far, Zatko has accused three: China, Russia, and India. Yes, in his testimony, Peter Zatko has claimed that India forced Twitter to put an agent on payroll to find out if the company was willing to concede to social media curbs. This is an allegation at best. Zatko hasn't offered much proof. In fact, most of his claims are uncorroborated and appear to have little documentary support. Twitter itself has called Zatko's testimony a false narrative riddle with inconsistencies, inaccuracies, and lacking important context. Interestingly, this entire fiasco is perfectly timed for Elon Musk, the Tesla chief who has just abandoned his $44 billion Twitter buyout bid. He's now using Zatko's allegations as an excuse to justify his decision. Zatko, too, has directly referred to Elon Musk's questions on bot accounts in his testimony. But the biggest highlight from this story is how Twitter often bows before governments. You see, this is not the first time Twitter has been accused of abetting censorship. Time and again it has been found aiding governments in suppressing free speech. During the Arab Spring, Twitter was accused of imposing a gagging system in some countries. In France, the company was accused of suspending accounts that parodied former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. And in the United States, the company has been accused of censoring conservatives at the behest of liberal lawmakers. The list of allegations is longer, but you get the point. Twitter has often been found making compromises to keep its business running. The allegations made by Peter Zatko are not the first, and from the looks of it, they definitely won't be the last. The thing is, governments the world over employ surveillance as a means to keep a check on security threats, be it China, be it Israel, or even the United States, the birthplace of most social media platforms. All these countries maintain some sort of control over tech giants. But should they be allowed to? It's a debate that's not ending anytime soon. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Here's something else governments world over do. They name and rename cities, towns, and sometimes even the country. Case in point, Kazakhstan. The country has decided to rename its capital. Nur Sultan will now be called Astana. Let's tell you, it was only in 2019 that the capital was renamed Nur Sultan from Astana. So what explains this strange reversal? Our next report tells you.
What's in a name? Apparently a lot. Ask Kazakhstan and it will tell you. The country is once again changing the name of its capital. It will now be called Astana, just as it was up until 2019. In March that year, Astana became Nur Sultan. The city was named after Kazakh President Nursultan Nazarbayev. He was the country's authoritarian leader. He had ruled Kazakhstan ever since it broke away from the Soviet Union. In 2019, Nazarbayev announced his resignation. He was replaced by loyalist Ruslan Zeldebey. It was his idea to rename Astana to Nur Sultan. Goes without saying, the rebranding was to honor the outgoing leader. So what changed? Zeldebey did. After taking over as president, he distanced himself from Nazarbayev and his policies. The new president brought in reform, but Nazarbayev retained enormous influence. He was still the head of the ruling party. In January this year, riots broke out in Kazakhstan. It was partly triggered by rising prices, and partly because of popular dissatisfaction with Nazarbayev's influence in the country. Following the riots, the former president was stripped of his title, Elbasi, which meant the leader of the nation. Nazarbayev was also removed from his posts in the ruling. In June, Kazakhs voted for changing Nazarbayev-era laws. So, for Kazakhstan, renaming its capital Astana means change. And as oxymoronic as it may be, in this case, restoring the old name means moving on to a new era. You know, names are more political, more significant than we think they are. Sometimes places are named after people who were once in a position of power. The US has some great examples. Its capital, Washington, D.C., is named after American President George Washington. The city Cleveland is named after Continental Army General Moses Cleveland. Sometimes places are named according to their surroundings, their geography. Did you know India gets its name from the river Indus? In the last 75 years of independence, India has changed the name of several cities. Even 3 of its 4 metro cities. Bombay became Mumbai, Calcutta became Kolkata, and Madras became Chennai. For India, renaming its metros meant breaking free of colonial hangover, acknowledging the local language and the local culture, and upholding quasi-federalism. Sri Lanka also got rid of the name Ceylon for the sake of a new start. The British would call the country Ceylon. The independent country wanted to be known as Sri Lanka. In 1937, the Irish Free State changed its name to Ireland. This was the country's way of snubbing the United Kingdom. Names are also more sensitive than we realize. Why do you think Turkey was renamed Turkey? Because some people did not like the idea that their country shares its name with the Thanksgiving bird. The Netherlands makes a fine case study in rebranding. Not too long ago, the country was called Holland. It was the nickname the country's football team often went by abroad. The tourism board's web address also was holland.com, but Holland actually is the name of just 2 provinces in a country of 12. There is North Holland, of which Amsterdam is a part, and South Holland, the province that houses Rotterdam. So in late 2019, the country decided to rebrand itself and do away with the moniker altogether. The idea was to make the Netherlands inclusive. History is filled with examples of countries renaming themselves. Iran was once Persia. Thailand was Siam. Cambodia was Democratic Kampuchea. It was also called Khmer Republic, the Kingdom of Cambodia, and the State of Cambodia. Imagine one country and so many names. So what really is in the name? Sentiments, politics, emotions, history, and a glimpse into the future. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
And our final story this evening is about a drug. It is being touted to increase survival rates for cancer patients. It is a very popular drug. Some of you may even have it in your medicine box right now. I'm talking about aspirin, the humble aspirin. In case you aren't familiar with this drug, don't worry, we have you covered. Aspirin is also known as acetyl salicylic acid. It was developed in the 1890s. This drug is normally taken to relieve pain, inflammation, or fever sometimes. Aspirin is also used as a blood thinner. This is an over-the-counter drug, meaning in most countries, you don't need a prescription to buy aspirin. And now, a team in Cardiff University studied past research involving aspirin and cancer. They found two important things. One, patients who took aspirin survived longer. Think about that. And two, aspirin reduced abnormal clotting and abnormal blood vessel growth. This review was published in a journal of the Royal Society. Researchers said that there, quote-unquote, appears to be an impressive harmony between the biological effects of aspirin on mechanisms relevant to cancer and the effects of aspirin on clinical outcomes in cancer. Experts further say that the analysis underlines what is already widely known. One, the aspirin helps in increasing the chances of survival. And two, that aspirin helps prevent the spread of cancer to other parts of the body. But what we need to understand is how effective aspirin really is. Also, what kind of patients do really benefit from this drug? How much aspirin should they take? And for how long? These are important questions, and these are questions we don't really have answers to as of now. And to try and answer them, another study is being conducted. The trial is expected to involve 1,000 participants. Many of them will also be from India. The rest from the United Kingdom and Ireland. Researchers will also try to find whether aspirin can prevent cancer-related deaths. Also, whether it can prevent recurrence, or what we all call a cancer relapse. A study published in 2017 linked aspirin to lower risk of breast cancer. Researchers studied 57,000 women for 8 years, after which 3% of them were newly diagnosed with breast cancer. Researchers found that those who took a low dose of aspirin 3 days a week had significantly fewer breast cancers. So what do they mean by low dose, 18 mg? An analysis published in 2017 reviewed findings of 13 studies. It found a 14% lower risk of breast cancer after taking aspirin for a period of 5 years. A 27% lower risk of breast cancer after 10 years of taking aspirin, and a 46% reduction in breast cancer risk after 20 years of using aspirin. Other studies have suggested that aspirin can lower the risk of liver cancer, prostate cancer, also colon cancer. If these findings can be confirmed, if aspirin's anti-cancer effects are indeed confirmed, then there's no doubt that aspirin will soon be called a lifesaver and not just a pain reliever. The humble aspirin will be able to help us save lives. But until then, just like all other drugs, you must tread with caution when consuming aspirin. Like we always say, when it comes to matters of health, talk to your doctor first. So should you take aspirin or should you not take aspirin? Well, only your doctor will be able to answer that question for you. And before we wrap up, let's now see what else made news. Time for Gravitas Global Headlines.
Ukraine's President Zelensky pays a surprise visit to the recaptured town of Izium 5 days after Ukrainian forces took back control of the northeastern region of Kharkiv. Ukraine earlier said it had liberated around 8,000 square kilometers of territory so far this month. Reports say the United States is considering options for a sanctions package against China to deter it from invading Taiwan, with the European Union facing diplomatic pressure from Taipei to do the same. The European Union outlines plans to raise more than $140 billion to cope with an energy crisis that has increased the prospect of winter fuel rationing, corporate insolvencies, and economic recession. Fresh clashes erupt between Azerbaijan and Armenia amid international peace efforts. This a day after nearly 100 soldiers were killed in fighting between the two sides. The Taliban says it has killed 40 members of a rebel force, including 4 commanders in the northern Afghanistan province of Panjshir. Resistance groups have been clashing with Taliban fighters in the area since the Taliban took over Afghanistan last year. The European Union's second highest court upholds the bloc's record fine of more than $4 billion against Google over its Android operating system for mobile phones. 2 Palestinians shot dead by Israeli troops and an Israeli army officer killed in clashes near Jenin in West Bank during raids. A Lebanese woman forces staff at a bank in Beirut to hand over thousands of dollars of her own money by waving what appeared to be a handgun in a bid to fund what she said was medical treatment for her sister. Robert Lewandowski's return to Bayern Munich ended in defeat as the German champions beat Barcelona 2-0 in the Champions League. Lewandowski was wasteful and Bayern took advantage by scoring twice in 4 second-half minutes. Liverpool returned to winning ways with a 2-1 victory over Ajax. Phoenix Suns owner Robert Sarver has been suspended for a year and fined $10 million after an NBA investigation into claims of workplace misconduct. The investigation, which interviewed 320 people and scrutinized 80,000 documents and videos, found that Sarver engaged in conduct that clearly violated common workplace standards.
And with that, it's a wrap. Thanks for watching Gravitas with me, Priyanka Sharma, as always, leaving you with Gravitas images.